Good morning. We will start our first week on the study of Romans this week. This week's going to be spent mostly on the background associated with Romans, where we are, the people, the time. Before we get started, Larry, can you lead us in a word of prayer?
Our God and Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we have to come together and to look into your word, Lord. Pray that you be with us and be with Jeff as we look at Romans this morning and in the coming weeks, Lord, that you please help us to allow these things to enter our hearts and to be something that we think on, Lord, to change our lives. Father, we thank you so much for your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right. So when you look at the book of Romans, one of the things I like to do when we get started is, what do the scholars think about Romans? What is their view of Romans in the New Testament? So what I did was I put a background so it's hard to read, so hopefully you guys can focus. John Chrysostom was one of the early church fathers, and he thought so highly of Romans that he had the book read to him twice a week. So no matter what part of his life he was in, he would have some of his students come in and read the book to him twice a week. That's how important he thought it was. Augustine said he actually was historically viewed to have been converted based upon just reading two verses, Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. Martin Luther, who everybody knows, viewed this as the greatest book in the New Testament. This epistle is really the chief part of the New Testament, the purest gospel. It is worthy not only for every Christian, every Christian should know the word, by heart, but occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of the soul. It can never be read or pondered too much. And the more it is dealt with, the more precious it becomes and the better it tastes. So, Martin Luther, clearly, everyone understands the role he had in the Reformation of the church. Martin Luther always kind of lost a little esteem with me because he didn't like James, and I thought James was one of the better books of the New Testament, so take it for what it's worth. John Calvin, once again, the Calvinism. When anyone understands this epistle, he has a sure road open to him to a fuller understanding of the Scriptures. I don't think you all can read that. That's why I wasn't clicking. Frederick Godec, he was a French composer and philosopher. Spiritual revival in the church will be connected to a deeper understanding of Romans. The book of Romans is the cathedral of Christian faith. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodists, said he was converted based upon Luther's introduction to Romans. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, two of the more modern Western philosophers, wrote, "This is arguably the most influential book in the New Testament, perhaps in the history of Western civilization." And then I hope I got the last one. Yeah, I didn't have that in my notes, but this one I thought was funny. G.K. Chesterton, he was a well-known Christian writer. He was asked, what book would you have on a deserted island? And being a pragmatic philosopher, he said, Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding. Okay, so then when pressed, he said, if other than that, I would have the book of Romans. So as you can see, historians really view this book as being central to what we are as Christians and how the early Testament Christian church was established. It's unique in a lot of ways, and we'll go into that. The author of this book is pretty clearly identified. Paul wrote this book, and if you go through secular history, most of the stuff in the New Testament, everyone's got a different point of view. Very few of them will have a problem with Paul as the writer of this book. Paul clearly expresses that he has never been to Rome. He wrote the letter to Rome just kind of as an admonishment, which is why people like Luther and others view this as a full book. It is the longest of Paul's letters. It is the one that is most dealing with how a Christian church should operate. And it's interesting that Paul is writing this to a group of people he generally doesn't know. So, Paul has never been there. He wrote it around 57 AD from Corinth. It's pretty clear from the writings that Paul has in 1 Corinthians that that's what he's referring to. He's putting together the collection for the Christians in Jerusalem, and he's about ready to make that journey. I always like to kind of understand where people are in their lives when they're doing things. So, and I'm going to go through kind of a timeline of Paul's life, but also where he stands in relation to the Roman emperors, because this book is actually fairly important where it falls in line with the Roman emperors. Paul is about 51 when he writes this. Once again, anytime I give you ages or dates, it's approximate times that you can read all you want on exactly when these occur. There are many different points of view. But he is probably in his early 50s, and he's been a Christian for about 24 years. So to give you a sense, if you're a male and you live past the age of 10 in this time, you will die by the time you're 50. That's kind of the general rule of thumb. Paul is in the latter stages of what he would be viewed as an old man in the society in which he's dealing with. 51, you have kind of reached your apex in that society as far as age. There are 28 people who are in Rome that Paul addresses in the letter. 29 in total. One of them is not in Rome. And it's weird that he kind of addresses these people in chapter 16, but I think it's Paul's way of trying to personalize the letter. Once again, he's never been there. So he tries to go through that, and we'll deal with at the end of class today kind of who those people are. We don't have a lot of background on them, but we do have some. Where is Paul, and what is kind of Paul's background? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Most everybody here knows Paul pretty well. Paul was a Jew, but he was also uniquely a Jew in that he was a Roman citizen. And we find that in Philemon and Acts both. Paul was a tent maker by trade, and we know that because he runs across Aquila and Priscilla in Acts, and they say they start a business together as tent makers. If you get bored and you're like me and you really kind of want to understand who the people are who are writing these books, I did a tremendous amount of reading about, was Paul wealthy? Okay, so we know that Paul goes and studies with Gamaliel in Jerusalem. So he's relatively young when he does that, somewhere between the age of 14 and 24 is probably the expected time. But in order to go from Tarsus to Jerusalem and reside there under the teaching of a preeminent Jewish scholar like Gamaliel, you probably have money. I mean, you probably come from money. There's really not a scenario you can come up with where Paul's initially in this part of his life, his family is not wealthy. He's in the city, he's being taught by an eminent scholar, and he obviously is not living a slumly life. He's being treated well. We look later in Paul's life when he goes about persecuting Christians. He's in fairly high stature in the Jewish community. He has very high contacts, and he has access that generally is only reserved to people of wealth. Now, that leads to the question of, well, then how did he become a tent maker? And that's where I will leave it to you to do your own studies. It goes on for a while. There are very divergent points of view about why Paul became a tent maker, if you accept my assumption that he came from a wealthy family. But I can honestly tell you there is no consensus. Some will claim that his family disowned him when he became a Christian apostle. Others claim that he never really was that wealthy. So you can do your own study on that. But Paul was clearly a man who had a deep background in the understanding of the Jewish religion. He clearly had access to the teaching, and he was clearly well respected. The first time we see Paul is, as everyone knows, is he was the person that the people who stoned Stephen laid their robes down in front of. And that kind of is the first introduction to this man who we later find out made it his mission to kill Jews. Okay? That was his mission because he felt very strongly as a Pharisee that the whole concept of Christ was in no way in keeping with his Jewish religion. And remember, Jews, when they were thinking of the Messiah, were not thinking of Christ. They were thinking of someone who was going to give them an earthly reign of 2,000 years. Christ fit that in no way, shape, or form. So Paul, with his immense education, with his background as a Pharisee, with the teachings that he had gotten from Gamaliel, knew what the Jews were expecting in the form of a Messiah. And Jesus definitely wasn't it. We know that in Acts chapter 9, we read through, I'm not good with this clicker. We read through his conversion on the road to Damascus, and then we're going to go through kind of his timeline after that. Kind of how, I think most people think of Paul as having been kind of converted on the road to Damascus, and he immediately becomes an apostle. That's not how Paul's life developed, and we'll go through that with a little bit more kind of in background. So before we get into kind of more of that, I just want to just kind of open up a little bit. When you think of Romans, Andy, what comes to mind? Grace. Larry?
I just think of kind of how it's well structured. I guess coming from an engineer perspective, but it's, and I always think of Romans, in Romans 6 where it says the one verse that pops out to me is, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. So that's one that pops out, and I think it probably gives an idea of what's in the book. That it talks about the sinfulness of man, but then the gift of God through Christ.
Any other thoughts? Okay. So I'm going to go through the timeline of Paul, and I couldn't get the slide to work exactly right, so you're going to have to deal with my lack of PowerPoint skills. Paul is born about 6 AD. He's, as we've stated, he's born in Tarsus. He stutters under Gamaliel from 20 to 30 AD, most likely. Once again, you can take a look at any other commentaries and historical accounts, and you'll come up with some varying dates. He's converted, spends 3 years in Arabia. So right after Paul's conversion, he goes to Arabia for 3 years, and that's all we really know, but it's pretty well documented. And that takes him through 36 AD. He preaches in Tarsus, which most people skip over. For 8 years, Paul is teaching in his hometown, which is kind of unique. We don't have any documentation of what goes on there. But imagine going home with the history and the tradition that Paul has. Okay, so you return home. Everybody knows who your mom and dad are. They know you're a Roman citizen, and they know you're a Pharisee. And they know that you set out to kill Christians. So he spends 8 years at home preaching Christ. So that, if you want grounding, go back to the people who knew you were as a kid. So all of you, when Kathy talks about her kids, let me tell you, Brandon and Aaron do not appreciate it as their younger years. You is the same way. If your kids come home, you remember them as kids. If you were friends of theirs or friends of their parents, more likely, you remember them as kids. It's a unique experience to go back home. You've changed. They've changed. So Paul spends his first 8 years, actually after the 3 years in Arabia, he spends those years at home preaching the gospel. He joins Barnabas in Antioch and starts his period of missionary journeys around 46 AD. So Paul's about 40 years old when that happens. So he's starting his missionary journeys at 40. The reigns here are important. Tiberius is the ruler of Rome during the initial years of Paul's life. Rome is the center of the world as they know it at that point. Tiberius doesn't like Jews. He banishes certain Jews from the city, but it gets a little bit more clear later on. We don't know much about Caligula and his dealings with the Jews. We do know Claudius. Claudius reigns for about 14 years in Rome, and he is going to have an immense impact on the church in Rome. Now, see, if I was good at PowerPoint, this would all have rolled out for you, but I'm not. Barnabas and Paul begin their first missionary journey, and it ends in 48. They go to Jerusalem and begin their second missionary journey, which ends in 52. The third missionary journey and the writing of the letter to the Romans is during that third missionary journey, which is around 57 AD. Some will say 56. Paul returns to Jerusalem and is arrested in Caesarea. And he appears before Festus and appeals to Rome, and that happens around 60. And he's under house arrest for the first time in Rome from 60 to 62. So that's kind of Paul's timeline that we want to deal with. I want to spend a minute on Claudius, who's the emperor during the early establishment of the church in Rome. It's been established since probably after Pentecost. But Claudius has a tremendous impact in that in 41 AD, he pretty much puts the Jews under strict rule. The Jews are a separate group in Rome. They don't socialize. They don't interact. They have their own separate parts of the city, and they stay there. And they are starting to create problems for Claudius. They're a separatist group. They still believe in the Messiah. They believe that Rome will be overthrown. And Claudius doesn't respond well. He first responds in 41 by putting very strict restrictions on how they can meet, where they can meet, and who they can meet with. In 49, he's had enough. You're gone. Jews are expelled from Rome. They are literally kicked out of Rome. Synagogues are closed down. Jews are sent elsewhere. And that is pretty much in keeping with Acts. We find in Acts chapter 18 that two of the Christians in Rome are expelled, and it says so in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, and that's Aquila and Priscilla. It says that they were expelled during the time of Claudius. So Luke is very much in keeping with the historical account. But so if you think about it, the church in Rome is established most likely after Pentecost. We know in Acts chapter 2 that some of the people who were at Pentecost were Jews who were there from Rome. Most historians believe that the Christian church was established in Rome by people returning from Pentecost and then by people just traveling through Rome who are Christians. Kind of put it to our current context, the number of people that flow through Charlottesville. People come here for the university, people come here because of the law school, people come here for the grad school. The church gets established. Rome is even a bigger cosmopolitan area of the world at that point. And most historians believe that the church is established by that method. The Jews return from Pentecost, and then people travel through who have become accepting of Christ. And most likely what has happened is the Christian Jews are interacting with the traditional Jews through the synagogue. But this all changes in 49. The synagogues are closed down. The Jews are sent out of Rome. Now, think about the Christian church now. There are no Jews. Gentiles are running the Christian church in Rome, starting in 49 AD. So, the way I would think of that is, mom and dad have left home. The Gentiles don't come from the same traditional views of Christianity as the Jews. A lot of what Paul writes about is the conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles as the Christian faith is developing. Claudius has created a church that is purely Gentile. Gentiles' backgrounds are most likely monotheistic. They are not rooted in the Old Testament. They don't really care about the Old Testament, just to be perfectly candid with you. So for 5 years, the church in Rome is exclusively Gentile. And so Paul is writing to a group of people that is immensely unique. Paul has never written to a group that is this segregated. Paul, in all of his other writings, has Jews amongst the Christian church. This church has now spent 5 to 7 years without Jews. And Jews are coming back. Claudius's time ends and Nero becomes the emperor. Nero clearly welcomes Jews back early in his reign. So as Paul is writing this book, Jews are starting to come back into Rome and reestablish themselves in the Christian church. This creates problems. Okay, so once again, keeping with my analogy. Mom and dad have been gone for 5 to 7 years. Okay. Just think about it yourself as a kid. Your mom and dad are not establishing rules for you, and mom and dad move into your house. What happens? Mom and dad's rules apply anymore? They're in your house now. And that's the dichotomy that's starting to occur as Paul's writing this letter. Jews are coming back and trying to establish their rules in a church that is predominantly house-based and has no heritage to the Jewish faith. So Paul spends a lot of time in the book of Romans trying to come to common ground and make sure the Gentiles understand the relationship of Jews to Christ, and making sure Jews understand the Gentiles are not required to follow the Jewish traditions. And it leads to a lot of what Paul writes here, but it also leads to a lot of his writings around the role of the Christian church in a godless society, which Rome is clearly a godless society. So I'll try and catch up with my clicker here. So as I said before, Paul has written this book from Corinth. He's at the end of his third missionary journey. Nero is in charge of Rome at this point. Nero, as those of you who have studied history know, he was very young when he became the emperor of Rome. And early on, he was very successful. He picked up a wealthy, well-done city that was actually thriving. The political situation is very calm for Roman times. The Jews are coming back into the city. The Christians are accepted within. They're kind of viewed as an interesting clique. But there's no persecution. There's no real open hostility towards religion in general, but it's particularly towards the Jews and the Christians at this point. Once again, as I've said, most of the people in Rome are polytheist. They believe in lots of gods, and they know that the emperor is God incarnate. So like I said, it's relative peace. The church in Rome, as best we can tell, is predominantly Gentile, which is, for Paul, kind of interesting. He is the apostle to the Gentiles and has written that in a number of his books and kind of views that as his role amongst the apostles. So as you can imagine, a church that is predominantly Gentile, Paul has a burning desire to come see them. We've talked about how it was founded. The church, as best we can tell, and this is another interesting set of reading if you'd like to do it. The church was founded without any apostolic oversight. Now, you're going to have people who, of certain faiths, who disagree with that. The Roman Catholics clearly believe that Peter established the church in Rome. Okay? That's kind of part of their heritage. It's part of their beliefs. The problem they have is there's no historical account of Peter being in Rome during this time. None. I mean, it's interesting. It's nice speculation. But there is no historical reference to Peter being in Rome during this time. In fact, there's very little historical record of Peter ever being in Rome, though most scholars do believe that Peter died in Rome. But if you look for documentation of Peter's presence in Rome, it's very, very limited. So once again, there's plenty of writings out here on this, and it's an interesting reading. But chances are this church grew through people who had learned about Christ and returned to the city. And so it does not have a lot of the characteristics of the churches that you read about in the New Testament. There has been no apostle to establish the church. There has been no, for lack of a better word, Christian leadership that started this church. This is a church that was organically grown and nourished. And they do very well. And that's why Paul says their prominence is known throughout the Christian world. But it's a unique set of people. It's in a unique environment. It does not have a founding father. And Paul actually says in Acts chapter 15, part of the reason he hasn't been to Rome yet is he doesn't want to till soil that it was established by others. So, I mean, it is a church that has no, for lack of a better word, founding member that we're aware of. So it makes it very unique in the New Testament times. It is a very, very unique church. You know, the worship, the references are there, but as Paul is writing this, the church is meeting probably in about 4 houses, which we can see from Acts chapter 16. And the interesting thing about this church is the diversity of its members. Rome at that time was about 1 million citizens. Anywhere from 15 to 20% of those citizens were slaves or freed slaves. So when you think about that, that's a fairly large set of the population that is poor. Now, once again, Roman slaves took up, there was about 7 classes of them. I'm not going to go through them all, but that dealt from the British concept of indentured servants were viewed as slaves. The people who were conquered were viewed as slaves. And then there were people brought in to support the Roman economy, and they were brought in as slaves. So a number of the people who are mentioned in Romans 16 are clearly slaves. So the slaves make up a portion of the Roman church. What portion we'll never know. It's clearly made up of Jews. It's clearly predominantly made up of Gentiles. It's made up of tradesmen. And there appears to be some wealthy people scattered around that because of the houses and the way it's described. But the church in Rome is immensely diverse because it's like any other transient city. It brings in people of very different backgrounds. And so it kind of fits more the profile you would see of an American church. Yeah? You pick a big city in the U.S. that has a church. It's not made up of a single family. It's not made up of a single type of tradesman. It's made up of a huge, diverse group of people. That's the church in Rome. And that actually makes it fairly unique from the churches that Paul has established. Why is it important? I think Larry hit on that extremely well. It is a letter that covers time. It's dealing with the establishments and the interaction of a church. And it's dealing with it at a base level. It's saying, here's how you're supposed to behave with each other. It's the longest of Paul's letters. It's also the one that quotes the Old Testament the most, which is unique since he's writing to Gentiles as a predominant group. But he quotes the Old Testament 62 times. And once again, he's generally quoting the Old Testament when he's asking Jews and Gentiles to get along. He's trying to establish in the Gentiles' mind the heritage and the role that the Jewish Christians are playing in the church and what their history is with God and their as a chosen people. So once again, Larry dealt with this part where, first word that Andy gave you all was grace. And that's really kind of the theme of the book is how do you obtain salvation? And why is salvation so important? Okay, I'll jump ahead since we just got to the first bell. I want to go through kind of quickly why it was, what Paul states as his reasons for writing this particular book, and basically do that fairly quickly since we have 5 minutes. So it was to establish the believers in the faith, meaning why are you here? What is it that has drawn you together? Chapters 1 through 8 kind of deal with how do you go about obtaining salvation. So it's a very structured book, as Larry says. It very clearly spends the early part of the book making sure the Jews and the Gentiles are on the same page about how you obtain salvation. Then chapters 12 through 16 deal with what I was talking about before, shows that the gospel is valuable whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. He then prepares them for his arrival. Paul has said he's going to go to Spain as a missionary, and on his trip he's going to stop in Rome. and he's eagerly anticipating that stop. And then he talks about kind of the people that are important in the Church of Rome, in Paul's perspective. So we will pick up next week with the people that are mentioned in chapter 16, because they kind of give you an overview of the church and its makeup, and then we'll go right into chapter 1. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yep. Hopefully there'll be more talking next week. It's hard to do when you're doing an overview.
Yeah, and you're just getting, this is the first, study, first session.